A woman named Elena Castellan built her family's company for 11 years, and in one single afternoon at a shopping center she did not own, she watched her whole world nearly slip through her fingers while a stranger in a grocery apron stood between her daughter and two loaded guns. What happened in the 4 seconds that followed would end up changing more than just that afternoon. It would change how she understood power and who actually deserves to hold it. If you enjoy stories where quiet competence outshines status, where a humble man turns out to be the strongest person in the room, and where justice lands exactly where it should, press subscribe now so you do not miss how this one ends. Elena Castellan did not go to the mall that day for herself. She went because her daughter Mia had begged for new shoes for a school recital, and Elena, who ran a logistics and retail holding company worth more money than she liked to think about in casual conversation, had exactly 1 hour free in a calendar that otherwise belonged to other people. She remembered thinking as she parked the car that this was the first uninterrupted hour she had spent with her daughter in almost 3 weeks. She remembered feeling guilty about that. She did not yet know that guilt would feel like nothing compared to what was coming. Mia was 7, quick with her hands, quicker with her opinions, and she pulled her mother by 2 fingers toward the shoe store like she was towing a barge. Elena let herself be pulled. It was, she would think later, one of the last simple moments of that day. They passed a grocery kiosk near the mall's east entrance, one of those small attached markets that let shoppers grab essentials without leaving the building. Behind the register stood a man in a green apron, maybe mid-30s, quiet-eyed, methodical with his hands as he restocked a display of granola bars. Elena did not look at him twice. There was no reason to. He was furniture, the way most service workers were furniture to a woman who spent her life moving between boardrooms and airport lounges. She would come to regret that thought more than almost any other thought she'd had in years. His name was Daniel Reyes, and he had been working that register for 8 months, and if you had told him that morning he would be the reason a 7-year-old girl went home to her mother that night, he would have laughed, quietly, the way he laughed at most things now. Daniel did not laugh loudly anymore. He had not laughed loudly in 3 years. Not since his wife Sarah died in a car accident on a wet road outside Fort Bragg, leaving him with a 4-year-old daughter named Lucy and a set of skills the United States government had spent a great deal of money teaching him. Skills he had walked away from within a month of the funeral, because a man could not deploy overseas and also braid his daughter's hair for kindergarten picture day. He had chosen the hair braiding. He had never once regretted it. So Daniel Reyes stocked granola bars and rang up milk and eggs and drove his daughter to school every morning in a truck with a check engine light he kept meaning to fix, and nobody who watched him do any of this would have guessed that he used to be one of the most capable operators in a Tier 1 Special Forces unit. The kind of soldier other soldiers spoke about in careful, respectful tones. He had buried that man the same month he buried his wife, or so he believed. The 2 men who walked into the mall 20 minutes later did not look like much at first. That was the thing about real danger, Elena would reflect afterward. It rarely announced itself with menace. It walked in, wearing sneakers and hooded jackets, moving with the loose, unhurried gait of men who had cased the location and knew exactly where the cameras had blind spots. They were not there for the mall in general. They were there because someone had tipped them off that the Castellan Holding CEO would be shopping that afternoon with her only child, and that a woman like that was worth more in a single afternoon than most targets were worth in a year. Elena did not see them coming. She was crouched in the shoe store, holding a small sneaker up to Mia's foot, laughing at something her daughter had said when the first scream came from outside. Then a second. Then, the sound of a mall directory stand crashing to the floor, and Mia's hand no longer in hers, and a man's gloved fist closing around her daughter's arm, dragging her backward into the open concourse. Were the security guards, 2 of them, both young, both trained, mostly on shoplifting protocol and nothing resembling this. 2 stood frozen with their hands half raised and their radios useless in their pockets. Elena's mind did the thing minds do, in true emergencies. It went perfectly. Terribly clear. She saw the gun in the first man's hand. She saw it was pointed loosely toward the floor, but close enough to Mia's leg that the loose part did not matter. She heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt, saying, "Please, take anything. Just let her go." and she heard the man laugh, short and ugly, and say something about how Miss Castellan was about to make a very large withdrawal on her daughter's behalf. She did not know Daniel's name yet. She only knew that a man in a green apron had stepped out from behind the grocery kiosk, roughly 15 feet away, and that everyone else in that concourse, security included, was moving away from the danger while this one man was walking calmly toward it. Daniel did not remember deciding to move. That was not how it worked. Not really. Not after the training had rewired something so deep in him that it operated below the level of conscious choice. What he remembered, if you asked him later, was noticing the grip the first man had on the gun, too high on the slide. An amateur's grip, the kind that told you everything about how this would end if someone simply closed the distance fast enough and low enough that the man's eyes could not track it in time. He remembered noticing that the second man, the one covering the exit, had his weight on his heels instead of his toes, which meant he would be slow to pivot. He remembered thinking distantly the way you think about weather, that Lucy had a spelling test tomorrow and he still needed to quiz her on the word necessary, and that this had nothing at all to do with what he was about to do, and that some part of his mind produced that thought anyway, because that was simply what a father's mind did. Even in the 4 seconds before violence, he crossed the 15 feet in under 2 of those seconds. Elena would say later that she almost did not register him moving at all, that one instant he was a stranger in an apron, and the next instant he had the first man's wrist bent backward at an angle. Wrists were not built for. The gun clattering to the tile, the man's own scream swallowed by the crowds. And Daniel's other hand had already found the second man's collar and used his own momentum to drive him face first into a directory stand, the second gun skittering harmlessly under a bench. It took, by the timestamp on the mall's own security footage, 3 seconds and 41 hundredths. Mia was free before anyone else in that concourse had finished flinching. Daniel had both men on the ground, one with a dislocated wrist, one with a bloodied nose and a knee planted firmly between his shoulder blades, before the security guards had even finished drawing their radios. He said something low to the man beneath his knee, something none of the witnesses could later agree on exactly, though most of them remembered the tone more than the words. It was not a threat. It was quieter than a threat. It was the voice of a man who had said such things before, in circumstances far worse than a suburban shopping mall, and who found this particular circumstance almost restful by comparison. Then, because the mall's actual security had finally arrived, weapons drawn, shouting instructions that were 3 seconds too late to matter, Daniel stood, brushed off his knees, walked back behind the grocery kiosk, and resumed bagging a woman's order of 2 rotisserie chickens and a bag of oranges. Because she had been standing there mid-transaction when everything started, and her chicken, he said quietly, was getting cold. Elena stood in the middle of the concourse, with her daughter's face buried in her shoulder, Mia's whole small body shaking, and she stared at the man in the green apron ringing up rotisserie chicken as though the last 4 seconds had not just rewritten the rest of her life. It took Elena almost 11 minutes to get her hands to stop shaking enough to hold her daughter properly. Mall security cordoned the area, paramedics checked Mia for injury, and found none beyond a bruise blooming on her upper arm, where the gloved hand had gripped her, and 2 police units arrived to take the men Daniel had subdued into custody, both of them still groaning, one of them still cursing about his wrist. Elena answered questions in a voice she did not entirely recognize as her own, clipped and functional, the voice she used in board meetings, because it was the only voice she had left once the other one had used itself up screaming her daughter's name. Through all of it, she kept looking over at the grocery kiosk, where Daniel Reyes had gone back to his register, as though he had merely stepped away to help a customer find the paper towels. He answered the police officer's questions patiently. He gave a statement. He did not once mention what he used to be, or where he had learned to do what he did in under 4 seconds. And when the officer, a younger man, clearly rattled by what the footage showed, asked him outright whether he had prior training, Daniel said only, "A long time ago. Pace. Different life," and left it there, and something about the flatness of his voice told the officer not to push. Elena pushed. She could not help it. It was, in fact, the only thing she knew how to do when faced with a problem she could not immediately categorize. Footnote. She waited until the crowd thinned, until Mia had been settled onto a bench with a paramedic's blanket around her shoulders and a bag of pretzels she was not eating. And she walked to the kiosk and stood there for a moment before she said, "You saved my daughter's life." He looked up from the register, and for a moment his face did something complicated, something that was not quite discomfort and not quite modesty, something closer to a man recalculating how much of himself he was willing to let a stranger see. "She's all right," he said. "That's what matters." He did not say "you're welcome." He did not offer his name. He rang up a customer's bottled water like the conversation was already finished. Elena was not used to being dismissed, gently or otherwise, and she found herself oddly unmoored by it, the way a person feels unmoored standing on a floor they had assumed was solid. She asked his name. He told her, "Daniel Reyes." She asked how long he'd worked there. 8 months, he said. She asked, because she could not help herself, because it was the closest she could come to understanding what she had just watched, how a grocery cashier learned to disarm 2 armed men in under 4 seconds. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped into something private, something that was not meant for a crowd, even though there was no crowd left to hear it. "I used to be somebody else," he said. "Before my daughter needed a father more than the world needed a soldier. And then, because a woman was waiting behind Elena with a cart full of groceries, he simply went back to work, leaving that sentence sitting in the air between them, like something Elena would spend a long time trying to fully unpack. She thought about it the whole drive home. She thought about it while Mia, resilient, in the specific way only children can be resilient, fell asleep in the back seat, with her new shoes still in the box on the seat beside her, as if the afternoon's horror had simply been filed away under things that happened to other people. Elena did not have Mia's gift for filing things away. She lay awake that night, replaying the 4 seconds on a loop, the wrist bending back, the knee finding the space between shoulder blades, and beneath all of it, that sentence. "Before my daughter needed a father more than the world needed a soldier." She did not know exactly why it followed her into sleep. She only knew that it did. The mall's owners, embarrassed and legally exposed, moved fast to contain the story. But containment was not really an option once someone's cell phone footage of the incident hit the internet, grainy and shaky but unmistakable. A man in a grocery apron taking down 2 armed robbers in less time than it took to read this sentence. It reached local news by the next morning. It reached national news by the evening after that. Daniel's face, blurred at first, and then not blurred at all once someone recognized him from the footage, was suddenly everywhere, and reporters descended on the little grocery kiosk in numbers that its manager, a soft, anxious man named Gary, had never remotely prepared for. Daniel handled the attention the way he handled everything, which was to say quietly and with visible reluctance. He gave the minimum statement necessary, declined every interview request, and asked, more than once, that reporters leave his daughter's school out of it, a request most of them honored out of something like shame. What he could not control was the pace at which his old life caught up with his new one. Within 48 hours, someone, likely a veterans advocacy account, with more enthusiasm than discretion, had identified him publicly by his former unit affiliation. And suddenly Daniel Reyes was not simply a cashier who got lucky. He was Master Sergeant Daniel Reyes, formerly of a Special Operations Unit, whose actual designation was classified, but whose reputation among people who knew such things was considerable. He had left the service 3 years earlier under circumstances that were, according to one particularly persistent journalist, a medical discharge tied to a personal tragedy, and had, since then, apparently vanished from public record entirely, resurfacing only now, in an apron, having just disarmed 2 men without raising his voice. Elena read all of this from her office on the 14th floor of Castellan Tower and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could comfortably admit, unable to focus on the quarterly numbers in front of her. She had built her professional life around a simple principle, the same principle her father had drilled into her before he died and left her the company at 29 years old. Trust nothing you have not verified, and verify everything twice. It had served her well. It had also, she was beginning to suspect, cost her things she had not fully accounted for. She called the mall's general manager, and arranged, under the vague justification of corporate follow-up regarding the incident, to have Daniel brought in for a meeting. She told herself this was due diligence. She told herself a great many things over the following week that were not entirely true. Daniel arrived at Castellan Tower in the same clothes he wore to Lucy's school pickup, jeans and a plain gray jacket, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a lobby made almost entirely of glass and ambition. Elena met him at the elevator herself, which her assistant found notable enough to mention twice. She led him into her office, poured coffee, neither of them drank, and told him plainly that she wanted to do something for him. Money. A position if he wanted one in corporate security, at a salary that would have made most people's eyes widen. Anything, she said, within reason, that would properly compensate a man who had done what he did. Daniel listened to the entire offer without interrupting, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup like he needed somewhere to put them. And when she finished, he was quiet long enough that she began to wonder if she had somehow insulted him. "I don't need money," he finally said. "I need to be able to leave work at 3:15 on Thursdays, because that's when Lucy has her reading circle, and I haven't missed one yet. And I'd like to keep it that way." He looked at her, steady, unhurried, the same stillness he'd had in the 4 seconds that made him famous. "That's the only thing I actually want." Elena had negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions across 3 continents. She had never once, in her professional life, been handed a request so small it nearly embarrassed her by comparison. She sat with that for a moment, and something in her chest did something she did not have immediate language for. She offered him a position anyway, corporate security consultant, flexible hours built into the contract from day one, a salary that acknowledged what he'd actually done rather than what a cashier's job paid. Daniel took 2 days to think about it, which surprised her, because most people said yes on the spot to money like that, and when he came back, he said yes on one condition. He wanted it in writing, contractually, that no assignment would ever conflict with school pickup, with recitals, with the ordinary architecture of his daughter's childhood. Elena agreed before he even finished the sentence. She told herself, again, that this was simply good business. A man with his skill set was an obvious asset to a company her size, particularly one whose logistics operations moved through ports and warehouses that were not always as secure as she would like. She told herself this while scheduling a second meeting that had no real business purpose. She told herself this while finding, over the following weeks, small excuses to walk past his office on the 9th floor to ask his opinion on security protocols that her actual security director could easily have handled without her involvement. What she did not expect was Lucy. Daniel brought his daughter to the office one afternoon when his usual sitter fell through. Apologetic in a way that suggested he expected to be reprimanded for it, and instead found Elena crouched on the floor of the 9th floor break room 20 minutes later, helping a 6-year-old build a fort out of couch cushions while Mia, delighted to have found a co-conspirator, supplied structural suggestions. Elena had not built a couch cushion fort since she was younger than either of these girls. She had forgotten, somewhat completely, that she knew how. She watched Daniel that afternoon in a way she had not let herself watch him before, not as the man from the security footage, not as an asset to the company, but simply as a father, patient in a way she had never learned to be patient, correcting Lucy's grip on a marker with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything the footage had shown the world. He noticed her watching. He did not look away, which surprised her more than if he had. "She's good with Mia," Elena said, because she needed to say something, and it was true. And it was also not remotely the thing she was actually thinking. "They're good for each other," Daniel said. And then, quieter, "It's easier than I expected, being around people again." He did not elaborate on what he meant by people, but Elena understood somehow that he meant her specifically, and the understanding sat warm and unfamiliar in her chest for the rest of that day. Not everyone at Castellan Holdings shared Elena's growing regard for the new security consultant. Her cousin Victor Castellan, who sat on the board and served as chief operating officer, a position he had held for 6 years and clearly believed entitled him to a great deal more, made his opinion known within the first month. Victor had grown up 2 houses down from Elena's childhood home, had grown up hearing his own father complain bitterly that the company should have gone to him instead of to Elena's branch of the family, and had inherited that grievance the way some men inherit watches, wearing it everywhere, polishing it in private. Victor was, by every outward measure, exactly what a board wanted to see. Educated at the right schools, married into the right family, photographed at the right events. He was also, underneath all of it, a man who had spent years quietly resenting a cousin he considered less deserving and more lucky, and who had spent the last 2 of those years diverting small percentages of shipping contracts toward a shell logistics company he partially owned, skimming margins so carefully calibrated that no single quarter's numbers looked wrong on their own. Daniel's arrival made Victor nervous in a way he did not immediately understand, and then did. A man trained to notice inconsistencies, to read patterns other people missed. Working in security, with access to shipping manifests and warehouse logs, was not a man Victor wanted anywhere near his arrangement. So Victor did what men like Victor always did. He began carefully, deniably, to undermine. It started small. Comments at board meetings about optics, about whether it was appropriate for the CEO to have hired her own personal bodyguard using company funds, about whether Elena's judgment on this particular hire had perhaps been colored by something other than business sense. Victor was skilled at saying things that sounded like concern and functioned like poison. He cultivated allies among the board's older, more traditional members, men who already found Elena's leadership style too unsentimental for their taste, and were quietly delighted to have a reason to question it. Elena felt the shift before she could name its source. Meetings that used to move efficiently began stalling on procedural objections. Contracts that should have sailed through committee found themselves tabled for further review. She noticed it the way she noticed most threats to her company, which was early and with a cold, clear-eyed precision that had served her since she was 29 years old and burying her father while simultaneously running his empire. What she did not notice, not at first, was that Victor's campaign had a second front, one aimed not at her judgment but at Daniel directly. It surfaced at a quarterly board dinner, the kind of event Elena hated and attended anyway, because appearances mattered to the people who funded her company's growth. Victor, 3 glasses of wine, into an evening he had clearly planned in advance, brought up Daniel's employment in front of half the board, framing it, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, as a curiosity worth discussing. A checkout clerk, he said, with, what, a general education certificate, advising on 9-figure logistics security. I only raise it because I think we owe our shareholders a conversation about whether emotional decisions are driving personnel choices at the highest levels. He let the insinuation sit there, ugly and deliberate, in front of a room full of people who could vote Elena's authority into question. Daniel was not present for that dinner. He heard about it secondhand from Elena 2 days later, in her office, her voice carefully flat in the way it got when she was furious and refusing to show it. He listened to the whole account without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only, "Let him talk. Talking's easy." But something in his jaw had tightened, something that had nothing to do with his own reputation and everything to do with watching a woman he had come quietly to respect a great deal, absorb an attack meant to diminish her through him. Victor's campaign escalated because contempt, once it finds an outlet, rarely stays contained. He began leaking selectively edited details of Daniel's service record to a business journalist friendly to his interests, framing Daniel's medical discharge in language designed to suggest instability rather than grief. Or suggesting the board should be concerned about unvetted personnel with unclear psychiatric histories holding security clearance inside the company. He arranged, through an intermediary, for a formal motion to be introduced at the next board meeting, one that would require an independent review of Elena's hiring decisions over the past year, a review that would very publicly begin with Daniel Reyes. Elena discovered the extent of it only because Marguerite Odom, the company's longtime chief financial officer, a woman who had worked for Elena's father before she'd ever worked for Elena, came to her office late one evening with a folder she had clearly been sitting on for days, uncertain how to raise it. Marguerite had been quietly reconciling shipping manifests against contracted third-party logistics providers for weeks, a routine audit that had nothing to do with Victor at all, until the numbers stopped adding up in a specific, repeating pattern that pointed to exactly one signature authorizing exactly one recurring discrepancy. Victor's signature. Victor's shell company. Nearly 2 years of skimmed margins, carefully hidden inside contracts. Nobody had thought to double-check because Victor himself had approved the vendor relationships in the first place. "I didn't want to believe it," Marguerite said, sliding the folder across Elena's desk. "Your father trusted that boy, like a nephew. But the numbers don't lie, even when the people do." Elena sat with the folder for a long time after Marguerite left. She thought about Victor's dinner comments, about the leaked service records, about the motions scheduled for the next board meeting. And she understood, with the particular clarity that came from years of reading people who wanted things from her, that Victor was not simply resentful. He was desperate. A man skimming money for 2 years, suddenly facing a security consultant with the training to notice irregularities other people missed, had every motivation in the world to discredit that consultant before he ever got close enough to look. She called Daniel that night later than she would normally have called anyone for work, and told him everything. He listened in his particular way, absorbing rather than reacting, and when she finished he asked only one question. "You want me to look at the shipping data myself? Cross-reference the manifests against the port logs?" "I want you to be careful," Elena said, surprising herself with how much she meant it, how the words came out sounding less like an instruction and more like something closer to worry. "Victor's already trying to paint you as unstable. If he catches you digging into his numbers, he'll use it as proof." "Let him," Daniel said. "I've been called worse things by better men." And then, quieter. In the voice he seemed to reserve only for the moments that actually mattered to him, he said, "You don't have to protect me from this, Elena. I've spent a long time being underestimated by people who assumed quiet meant harmless. It's usually worked in my favor." The board meeting, where everything came to a head, took place on a gray Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, in the glass-walled conference room on the top floor of Castellan Tower, 12 board members present in person, 3 joining remotely. And Victor Castellan seated at the far end of the table with the particular confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He opened with his prepared motion, framing it with practiced smoothness, invoking shareholder responsibility, invoking Elena's father's legacy in a way clearly meant to suggest she was failing to honor it, invoking, finally, Daniel's employment as symptomatic of a broader pattern of what he called impulsive governance. Several of the older board members nodded along. Elena watched them nod, and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, the specific stillness she reserved for moments, when she needed every part of herself functioning at full capacity. She let Victor finish. She had learned, over 11 years of leading this company, that the most dangerous thing you could do to a man like Victor was interrupt him before he had fully committed to his own narrative. Once he sat down, satisfied, she stood. "Before we vote on Victor's motion," she said, her voice carrying the particular calm she had spent years cultivating, "I'd like to address something else, Marguerite, if you would. Hi. Tie." Marguerite Odom stood and distributed a set of folders around the table. The same folders she had shown Elena 3 weeks earlier, now expanded, cross-referenced, verified twice over. She walked the board through nearly 2 years of shipping manifests, through the specific discrepancy pattern, through the Shell Logistics Company, whose ownership records, once properly traced, led directly back to Victor Castellan. Victor's face, Elena noted, did not immediately change. He had, after all, spent years perfecting the art of looking unbothered, but his hands, folded on the table in front of him, had gone very still. The particular stillness of a man doing rapid arithmetic on how much trouble he was actually in. "This is absurd," Victor said, when Marguerite finished. "Coincidental invoice matching does not constitute proof of anything. If anyone should be questioned here, it's the qualifications of whoever compiled this." It was at this point that Daniel Reyes, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room at Elena's specific invitation, stood and asked whether he might add something. Several board members looked faintly surprised that the man at the center of Victor's original complaint was even present, which was, Elena suspected privately, exactly the effect Victor had been hoping his earlier smear campaign would produce. a room too dismissive of Daniel's credibility to take him seriously now. Daniel walked to the front of the room with a laptop under his arm, connected it to the display, and pulled up a set of port logs he had spent the last 2 weeks quietly cross-referencing against satellite tracking data for the shipping containers in question, the specific expertise he had developed not in a grocery store but in a career. Most of that room had no security clearance to know the details of. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform outrage. He simply walked the board through the physical movement of containers that, according to Victor's own paperwork, should not have existed at the ports where satellite data showed they had, in fact, been unloaded, diverted, and resold through the shell company's actual warehouse, 3 states away from where the manifest claimed. "I used to do this kind of tracking for a living," Daniel said when he finished, meeting Victor's eyes across the room without hostility, only a flat, unhurried certainty. "Reading patterns other people think are buried too deep to find. It's not that different from reading a man," he paused. "The numbers match the containers. The containers match the warehouse. The warehouse matches your signature. Victor. Victor. I'm sorry it has to be said out loud in front of everyone, but it does." The room was very quiet after that. Elena watched Victor's carefully constructed composure finally crack, watched him begin, too late, to reach for outrage that no longer had anywhere to land, and she stood again, letting her voice fill the silence he'd left behind. "I build my judgment on evidence and on people who earn trust rather than demand it," she said, looking not at Victor now but at the rest of the board. "Daniel Reyes has done more for this company's actual security in 3 months than most consultants manage in 3 years. And he did it while asking for nothing except time to be present for his daughter, which is more integrity than I've seen from people who've sat at this table for decades." She let that land. "Victor's motion is withdrawn, effective immediately, or I will bring these findings to the district attorney's office myself, and Victor can explain shipping fraud to people considerably less patient than this board." Daniel did not say anything further. He simply moved to stand slightly behind Elena's chair. Not looming, not performing strength, just present, the same quiet solidity he had brought to a mall concourse months earlier, and something about that stillness said more to the room than any speech could have. The vote to remove Victor from his position passed within the hour, unanimous except for his own abstention, and by the following week, the district attorney's office had opened a formal investigation into the shell company's finances. Victor's allies on the board, the ones who had nodded along with his earlier insinuations, found themselves considerably quieter in the weeks that followed, several of them privately reaching out to Elena to express support they had conspicuously failed to offer when it might have actually mattered. Elena, for her part, did not gloat. She did not need to. She spent the following months doing something she found, to her own quiet surprise, more satisfying than any acquisition she had closed in years. She restructured the company's board oversight to include independent financial audits twice yearly instead of once, closing the exact kind of gap Victor had exploited. She formalized flexible scheduling policies across every department, not just Daniel's contract, after realizing how many employees had been quietly struggling under the same rigid expectations that had once nearly cost her the chance to know a man like him at all. She thought more than once about her father, about the empire he built and the lessons he'd taught her about trusting only what could be verified, and she thought that he would have approved of the numbers, certainly. But she hoped, somewhere, he would have approved even more of what she'd learned to see beyond them. It was on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, months after the board meeting, that Elena found herself back at the same mall where it had all started, standing near the same grocery kiosk, though Daniel no longer worked the register there, having long since moved into his role on the 9th floor of Castellan Tower. He had come instead to pick up Lucy's favorite kind of oranges, the ones the school cafeteria didn't carry, and Elena had come because Mia wanted the same shoe store, the same recital, though this time nobody's hand was pulled away by a stranger and nothing in the concourse felt dangerous at all. They ended up sitting together on a bench near the fountain, the girls chasing each other in loose circles nearby, the ordinary noise of a Thursday afternoon washing over everything, and Elena found herself thinking back to the sentence that had followed her home the very first night. "Before my daughter needed a father more than the world needed a soldier. I've thought about that a lot," she admitted finally, watching Lucy nearly trip over her own shoelaces and laugh instead of cry about it. What you said. That first day, Daniel was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet she'd come to understand was not distance, but consideration. A man choosing his words with the same care he chose, which threats deserved his attention. "I meant it," he said, "but I think I understand it differently now than I did then." He watched the girls for a moment before he continued. "I thought walking away from who I used to be was the only way to be present for her. And I didn't think you could hold on to both. Turns out you can. You just need the right people around you to make room for it." Elena did not say anything immediately. She simply reached over, without any particular ceremony, and rested her hand over his on the bench between them. And he did not pull away, and neither of them felt any need to make the moment bigger than it was. Mia ran past, breathless, shouting something about ice cream, and Lucy followed a half-step behind her, and the fountain kept running the way fountains do, indifferent to everything. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt no urge at all to check her phone, to calculate the next quarter, to measure the moment against anything it needed to become. It was, she thought, simply enough, as it was, a bench, a fountain, two girls laughing somewhere nearby, a man's steady hand under hers, the same hand that had once moved fast enough to save her daughter's life, now, perfectly, deliberately, still. And that, in the end, was the real story, beneath the headlines, beneath the security footage that racked up millions of views, beneath the board meeting and the scandal and the vindication. It was never really about 4 seconds in a mall concourse. It was about a man who had given up his old life to build something quieter and more important, and a woman who had spent years believing that power and trust were the same thing, until she met someone who taught her, patiently and without ever raising his voice, that they were not the same thing at all. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one nobody bothered to notice, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not the 4 seconds of action everyone remembers, but the 3 years of quiet, unglamorous devotion that came both before and after it.